When I bought this house, I thought I was finally stepping into peace. A quiet neighborhood. A fresh start. I had worked for years to afford it, and finally it felt like mine. Nothing too fancy, just a cozy little home with a small porch out front. After I settled in, I decided to add something simple to bring life to the space. 2 ceramic flower pots. That's it. Matching, neat, clean, and filled with colorful seasonal flowers. They weren't in the way. They didn't block the walkway. And I thought they looked great. A few weeks went by and neighbors would walk past and smile. A couple of them even complimented the flowers. I didn't think twice about it, until one day I opened my mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA. I hadn't really dealt with the HOA before. I assumed it was all just about mowing lawns and keeping the place tidy. But the letter inside didn't seem friendly. They claimed I had violated a community appearance guideline and demanded that I remove the flower pots within 7 days. If not, I'd be fined. $25 per day. I was confused. I double-checked the HOA rulebook, the copy they gave me when I moved in. There was nothing that said small decorative flower pots weren't allowed. In fact, several houses on the same street had them. So I sent them a quick email. Polite, just asking for clarification. I figured it was just a mix-up. No response. A week later I get another letter. This one says I now owe $175 in fines and that the total will increase every day the pots remain. I started to feel uneasy. This couldn't be real. Surely someone had made a mistake. I tried to call the HOA, no one picked up. Then I left a voicemail. Nothing. I asked my next-door neighbor about it. He shook his head and said, "Oh, you're dealing with Karen, huh?" Karen was the HOA president. From what I heard, she liked things her way, and she didn't like being questioned. A few days later, I came home from work and saw a note taped to my door. It wasn't signed. It just said, "Remove the pots or pay the price. You've been warned." Now it was getting ridiculous. This wasn't just about pots anymore. It felt personal. But I stood my ground. I left the pots where they were. I wasn't going to let someone bully me into changing my own porch over nothing. Then, out of nowhere, I got a notice from the county. The HOA had filed a lien against my property. Over $425 in unpaid fines. They legally placed a hold on my house. And just like that, I couldn't sell it. I couldn't refinance it. I couldn't even make certain changes to it unless I paid the full amount. Over 2 small flower pots. I called the number on the notice. A woman answered. Cold tone. No sympathy. Was Karen. She said, "This is what happens when you break the rules." I was stunned. I wasn't breaking any rule. At least, not one that actually existed in the handbook. I checked it again and again. Now I was stuck. If I didn't pay, the lien would stay. If I did pay, I'd be giving in to a fake rule that never existed. And more than that, I'd be giving power to someone who clearly didn't care about fairness. I wasn't the type to start drama, but this had gone way beyond a simple disagreement. A lien on my house. For flowers? That felt insane. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I stepped onto my porch, those 2 little pots just sat there like quiet reminders that I was being punished for something completely harmless. I decided to talk to more neighbors. Maybe someone had dealt with this before. Maybe I wasn't alone. So I knocked on a few doors. One elderly woman told me she got fined last year for hanging a wind chime. Another neighbor said he was once cited for leaving his trash cans out for too long, even though it was only a couple of hours past pickup. There was a pattern. Everyone I spoke to seemed to have a story. Small things turned into big problems, all thanks to the same person, Karen. People said she didn't even own her house, she was just renting it. And if that was true, she wasn't even supposed to be on the HOA board, let alone running it. But nobody wanted to challenge her. They said she was controlling, always threatening fines, and constantly rewriting rules during HOA meetings that most people couldn't even attend. It felt like a little kingdom, and she had crowned herself queen. Still, something didn't sit right with me. I wanted to see those rules for myself, the original ones before Karen added her own spin to them. I contacted the HOA management company. They were supposed to keep copies of the community's governing documents. But when I asked for them, they said they'd have to check with the board first. I didn't trust that answer, so I pushed back. I told them, legally, they were required to provide them to any homeowner upon request. Suddenly their tone changed. I got an email back with an attachment, a PDF of the original bylaws. I read through every page. Guess what? Nothing about flower pots. Nothing about porch decorations at all, unless they were excessively large or obstructive, which mine clearly weren't. The rules had been twisted. And I had proof. I printed everything and started documenting my story. Dates, letters, screenshots of emails, pictures of the flower pots, the notes left on my door. All of it. I even found photos on Google Street View from before I moved in, showing other houses with porch plants. If this ever went to court, I wanted to be ready. But things didn't stop there. Karen must have found out I was asking around. The next week, I got another violation notice, this time for glossy paint on my front steps. I didn't even know paint could be a violation. Then came another fine. They said my mailbox numbers were not uniform with community style. I had just replaced them a few months back because the old ones were peeling off. It became clear, this wasn't about rules. It was about control. I went back to my neighbors and shared what I found, the real bylaws, the fact that Karen might not even be legally allowed to serve, and all the extra violations people had faced. Some were surprised. Others weren't. But the one thing they all said was the same: we're tired of it. That's when I brought up the idea of a petition. Not to start a fight, but to hold a vote. To challenge Karen's authority. To remind her that she wasn't above the rest of us. At first, people were nervous. Nobody wanted to be the one targeted next. But then one neighbor signed. Then another. Soon, I had over a dozen signatures. Word spread quickly. More people reached out. They had stories too. Some were fined for invisible weeds. Others for unapproved door colors. One person even said they got a notice for their garage being too cluttered, and that was based on a peek through a slightly open door. It wasn't just me. It was everyone. Now that I had real support from my neighbors, I felt like we could finally push back. The petition was growing. People who had been quiet for years were finally speaking up. Some even told me they had tried to fight back before but gave up because Karen made things so difficult. One neighbor said she was threatened with a lawsuit just for asking too many questions at an HOA meeting. But this time felt different. We were coming together. I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I didn't want to jump straight into legal action, but I needed to know what our rights were. I explained everything: the fake violations, the unapproved changes to rules, the lien on my property. He listened carefully and then asked me one question: did you ever sign anything saying you agreed to be part of this HOA? I paused. I thought back to when I bought the house. I remembered reading documents and disclosures, but I didn't recall any mention of HOA membership. So I checked. I pulled out all the purchase documents, the title report, and the disclosures from my real estate agent. And there it was. No mention of HOA dues. No recorded CC and RS attached to my property. In simple terms, I wasn't even officially part of the HOA. They had no legal authority over me. The attorney raised an eyebrow. He said, then they can't fine you. And they definitely can't put a lien on your home. That changed everything. I was angry. Not just because they lied. Not just because they put me through all of this stress. But because they were doing it to other people too. People who didn't know their rights. People who just paid the fines because they were scared. So I wrote a letter. A strong one. Backed with legal references, proof of non-membership, and a demand for immediate removal of the lien. I had the attorney review it before I sent it. Then I mailed it to the HOA, certified with return receipt. Less than a week later, I got a response. It was from the HOA's lawyer. Suddenly they were very polite. The tone had completely changed. They said the lien would be reviewed and possibly rescinded based on new information. No apology. No explanation. Just vague language trying to cover their tracks. But I didn't stop there. I contacted the title company that handled my home sale and asked them to confirm again, in writing, that no HOA covenant was ever attached to my property. They sent me an official letter that made everything crystal clear. I wasn't a member. I never had been. Armed with that letter, I returned to the neighbors. I told them the truth. Some were shocked. Others were furious. A few asked if the same might be true for them. Turns out, 2 of my neighbors were in the exact same situation. Their homes were never officially included in the HOA boundary. But they'd been paying dues for years. Getting fined. Threatened. All of it. Now it wasn't just a petition. It was a movement. We started gathering copies of everyone's title records. More and more people wanted answers. We even scheduled a neighborhood meeting. Outside, on the street, not under the HOA's control. Nearly 30 people showed up. At that meeting, I shared my experience from the start. I showed the original rules, the letter from the title company, the lien notice, everything. Other neighbors came forward too. The stories were unbelievable. One man had been fined for painting his fence the same color it had been for 10 years. Another woman said she was forced to remove a tree she had planted as a memorial for her late husband. People were done being quiet. We talked about next steps. Some wanted to dissolve the HOA completely. Others wanted to vote Karen out. But everyone agreed on one thing: this power grab had gone too far. Once we had that meeting, everything began moving fast. People who never said a word before were suddenly emailing, calling, even stopping by my house. One neighbor brought me a folder full of letters he'd saved, years of violation notices and fine demands from the HOA. Another came by just to say thank you. He told me he always thought something felt off but didn't know what to do about it until now. Then something interesting happened. Karen went quiet. She didn't respond to our petition. She didn't send any new violation notices that week. No emails. No HOA letters. Nothing. It was strange, and honestly a little unsettling. For someone who loved control, her silence felt like the calm before a storm. But we didn't wait around. A few of us got together and hired a real estate lawyer as a group. We wanted to know what options we had to remove her or at least limit her power. The lawyer reviewed the bylaws and pointed out something that Karen had been hiding. Any member of the board could be removed by a community vote. It had always been there. Karen had just made it sound like she was untouchable. So we did it by the book. We announced a special vote, mailed out notices, and even set up a proper voting box during the weekend, all legal, all documented. Karen showed up during the vote. She wasn't calm. She yelled. She said we were violating rules, that the vote was invalid, that we didn't have the authority. But she didn't bring any proof. Just her usual threats and demands. A few people stepped in to calm her down, but it was clear, she didn't like losing control. The vote went ahead. By Sunday evening the results were in. Over 75% of homeowners voted to remove Karen from the HOA board. It wasn't even close. Some people cheered. Others just looked relieved. For the first time in years, there was hope that things might actually change. But Karen didn't go away quietly. The next week, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA management company. She claimed the vote was unconstitutional, that we were spreading lies and that I was harassing her. I wasn't surprised. She was trying anything to stay in power. Luckily we had legal support now. Our lawyer sent the management company all the documentation, the original bylaws, the notices, the vote counts, and our legal right to organize a vote. He made it very clear, Karen had no leg to stand on. If she kept pushing, she could face legal consequences herself. After that, things began to calm down. But it wasn't over. We still had to undo the damage she'd caused. There were false liens filed against 2 homes. One neighbor had over $1,000 in fines she never should have been charged. Another had stopped doing any repairs because he was afraid of being cited again. It was going to take time to rebuild trust and restore fairness. That's when we decided to form a new committee. Not to replace Karen's control with more control, but to make sure no one else could ever abuse the HOA again. We wanted transparency. We wanted real community input. And most of all, we wanted kindness. We started with simple things. Clear meeting schedules. An open forum for questions. Monthly updates sent to everyone's email. Even small steps made a huge difference. People felt heard. Respected. And surprisingly, some of the most vocal neighbors who once seemed bitter or angry were actually just frustrated from being ignored for so long. Once they had a say, they started helping. One person offered to repaint old signs for free. Another helped clean up the community park. It felt like a fresh start. But Karen wasn't entirely gone. We heard she still lived in the neighborhood, though she kept to herself now. Some said she was bitter. Others said she'd moved away temporarily. I didn't care much either way. The important part was this: she didn't get to control our lives anymore. And while the experience had been exhausting, stressful, and at times surreal, it taught me something I never expected to learn just from planting a few flowers on my porch: how powerful it is when regular people stand up, speak out, and work together. It had been a few months since the vote that removed Karen, and slowly the neighborhood started to feel normal again. People smiled more. No one was peeking through blinds anymore, afraid of getting a warning note for their grass being a little too long or their trash bins not being pulled in by 9 a.m. Things felt lighter. But I wasn't quite ready to relax. Even though Karen was officially gone, we had uncovered something deeper. A pattern of misuse, intimidation, and silence that had affected more people than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about a system that had allowed her to do it for so long without any real challenge. One morning I received a knock on my door. It was Mr. Russell, a retired veteran who lived 2 streets over. I had seen him around, but we'd never really spoken. He looked nervous but determined. He said, "I think you should see something." He handed me an envelope. Inside were copies of letters from the HOA that dated back nearly 10 years. Each one told the same story. unfounded fines, threats of legal action, demands for changes to his property that weren't even in the original rules. Mr. Russell had paid over $5,000 in total over the years, just to avoid confrontation. "I always thought it was just easier to pay and stay quiet," he said. "But after seeing what you did, I realized maybe we should have spoken up sooner." His words stuck with me. That week, I printed out every rule, every bylaw, and every amendment ever made to our HOA documents. I sat down with a group of volunteers and we went line by line. Some rules had never been legally filed. Others had expiration dates that no one enforced. And a few had been changed without the proper number of votes. It was a mess. But this time we weren't overwhelmed. We were organized. We formed teams, one for reviewing documents, another for contacting affected homeowners, and one that focused on contacting the county records office to verify what had ever been officially recorded. And as we dug deeper, the truth became even clearer. Karen hadn't just bent the rules. In some cases, she created them entirely on her own. There were fees that had no legal basis, penalties invented out of thin air. And the worst part, the money collected from homeowners didn't match the maintenance expenses. The math didn't add up. We started collecting statements, old receipts, and transaction records. It wasn't easy. Some documents had gone missing. Others were locked behind email accounts we no longer had access to. But piece by piece it all came together. What we discovered was shocking. Over the last 5 years, more than $20,000 in HOA funds had gone unaccounted for. No records. No explanation. The management company Karen had worked with claimed it wasn't their responsibility to track minor purchases. But $20,000 wasn't minor. So we filed a complaint. Not just with the management company, but with the county as well. We submitted everything we found, organized into folders, backed with signed statements from over a dozen residents. The county investigator told us it would take time, but they were taking it seriously. The idea that Karen might have pocketed money from the neighborhood was something we all suspected. But now we had reason to believe it could be true. And that possibility lit a new fire in people. It wasn't just about bad rules anymore. It was about justice. We held another meeting. This time in the local community center. Over 60 people showed up, more than ever before. There were neighbors I had never even met before. People who usually stayed quiet now had their hands up, asking questions, offering help, and sharing their own stories. It was no longer just about removing Karen. Now it was about restoring trust, making things right, and making sure nothing like this could ever happen again. After that community center meeting, the momentum was unstoppable. What started as frustration over a few unfair fines had turned into a full-on neighborhood awakening. For the first time, we weren't just reacting. We were building something better. People started showing up early to meetings. They brought coffee, donuts, even notepads. Felt like a team. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were becoming a community again. And with every meeting, more people opened up. A woman named Stacy, who'd lived in the corner house for years, stood up and told everyone how Karen threatened her with legal action over a tiny flower bed she'd added in memory of her late husband. Her voice shook when she spoke, but by the end, people were clapping. Someone offered to help her rebuild the flower bed, and someone else said they'd help fight to get the fine reversed. Stories like that became common. And as those stories came out, something else happened. People stopped feeling afraid. Karen's silence had lasted for weeks now, and while part of me wondered if she was plotting something in the background, most people had moved past the fear. They were focused on fixing, healing, and holding everyone, including the HOA board, accountable. Meanwhile, the investigation we launched into the missing HOA funds was moving forward. The county had assigned a financial examiner to our case. He called to ask for more records and statements, which we had ready thanks to all the work our volunteers had done. He said it might take months but assured us, "You've got a solid case." While that process ran in the background, we focused on rewriting the HOA rules from scratch. We didn't want to just tweak Karen's system. We wanted to rebuild it completely. No more vague language. No more loopholes. We invited everyone to pitch in, and every rule we proposed had to pass a clear vote. One of the biggest changes we made was transparency. We created an online system where every financial transaction, every rule update, and every meeting agenda could be seen by any homeowner anytime. No more secrets. No more private fines or surprise violations. At first it was hard. Some people had gotten used to the way things were, even if they didn't like it. Change is uncomfortable. But once they saw that the new system was actually working, that real improvements were being made, even the skeptics came around. For example, instead of using fines as punishment, We introduced warnings with clear explanations and a grace period to fix the issue. It turned out most people weren't ignoring rules, they just didn't know they were breaking them. When treated with respect, they were quick to fix it. Another shift. Volunteers started maintaining shared spaces instead of outsourcing expensive services. A group of teenagers repainted the playground equipment. A retired couple planted flowers at the entrance gate. Everyone had a role. It made people proud of their neighborhood again. And just when we thought things were truly settling, we received word from the county investigator. They had finished their review. While he didn't give us every detail over the phone, he confirmed that formal charges were being considered. The missing funds weren't just lost. There were signs of personal use, things like gift shop receipts, boutique purchases, even hotel stays, all paid with HOA money. Karen was being called in for questioning. We didn't celebrate, not because we weren't relieved but because the damage had been real. People had lost sleep. Some had nearly lost their homes. But what mattered now was that the truth was coming to light. As for me, I looked back on how it all started, with a letter about a porch chair. One complaint turned into something much bigger. But if I hadn't spoken up, if others hadn't joined in, none of this would have happened. We had taken back our voice. And even though the road had been long and sometimes messy, we were finally starting to feel free. News about the investigation into Karen spread quickly, but what surprised everyone most was that she didn't deny any of it. Not at first. She stayed silent, refused to show up to the emergency board meetings, and ignored certified letters sent to her home. It was like she had vanished. But we knew she was still in town. A few people had seen her car parked at her sister's house just outside the neighborhood. At first it felt like the storm had passed, but deep down I knew better. Then one afternoon I got a letter. Not from the HOA. Not from the county. But from Karen herself. It was handwritten. Folded neatly. No return address. I opened it slowly, unsure what I was even expecting. Inside was a short message, barely a paragraph long. It said, "You think you won. But this place was better when people knew their place. Enjoy your little victory. I'll be watching." No signature. No date. Just that. It sent a chill down my spine. I debated whether to tell the others, but I figured it was best to let them know. We couldn't afford to fall back into fear or silence, especially now. We reported the letter to the county investigator and made a note to file it if things escalated. But as strange as it was, it didn't stop the progress we were making. By now, the new HOA board was fully up and running, made up of elected volunteers who had nothing to gain and everything to lose if they didn't act in the neighborhood's best interest. Financial reports were now posted monthly. Every homeowner had a say in decisions. And that toxic atmosphere Karen created? Gone. Still, people remained cautious. We didn't know what Karen might try next, and honestly, it didn't matter anymore. The important thing was that she no longer had power. And we had systems in place to protect against anyone trying to run the neighborhood like a personal kingdom again. But then came the twist no one saw coming. The county completed its full audit, and what they found was even worse than we had imagined. Over the years, Karen had opened a secondary bank account under a similar HOA name, funneling money from checks, late fees, and special assessments into it. She'd used that account to pay off personal debts, fund vacations, and even rent a storage unit, one we didn't even know existed. With a warrant, investigators accessed the unit. Inside were boxes of documents, receipts, and HOA materials dating back over a decade. But it wasn't just paperwork. They also found dozens of returned letters, fines, and warnings that were never actually delivered to homeowners. Letters that people had never seen. In some cases, the fines had still been added to their accounts without their knowledge. It became clear that Karen hadn't just been strict or power-hungry. She had been manipulating the system from every angle. By this point, the community's reaction shifted from anger to shock. Even her former allies, people who had once defended her, couldn't believe what they were seeing. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was now part of an active investigation for fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. But something unexpected happened as a result. People stopped seeing themselves as victims. They saw how strong they had become. We had turned chaos into order. We had turned fear into action. And now we were turning pain into justice. I watched as neighbors who had once stayed inside started waving at each other, chatting on sidewalks, hosting small block parties, and even planting trees together. You could feel it in the air. The neighborhood had healed. And I knew deep down we wouldn't go back. Not because we were lucky, but because we stood up step by step together. Weeks passed after the investigators cleared out Karen's storage unit, but the impact lingered. People couldn't stop talking about the records they found. Every few days, someone would mention another shocking detail that had surfaced. Apparently, Karen had even created fake violation photos by taking pictures of homes from odd angles to make it look like they were breaking HOA rules. Overgrown lawns, parked cars, even decorative flags. Some of the images were years old. She'd built her authority on lies. Carefully constructed ones. And we had believed them. Now no one was afraid to ask questions. No one backed down when something didn't seem right. Even the shyest neighbors had found their voices. We had built a kind of defense not just in paperwork or meetings but in trust. The way people looked out for each other had changed. And somehow that made the entire neighborhood feel new. Karen meanwhile was officially being charged. 3 felony counts and several misdemeanors. The news finally covered the story, and for the first time, people outside our little neighborhood began to understand what we had gone through. Journalists called it a quiet storm of local corruption. I called it survival. But even as that chapter neared its end, life kept moving. Grass still needed mowing. Kids still rode their bikes in circles. Packages were still delivered. And I started noticing something I hadn't seen in a while: peace. One afternoon as I walked my dog past the park, I saw a few kids playing tag. Their parents were talking nearby, not about Karen or the HOA, but about their weekend plans and how good the weather had been. I didn't realize how badly I had missed that normal, everyday conversations. A neighbor called out to me. "Hey, we're thinking of starting a garden club. Want to join?" I smiled and nodded. Why not? People were no longer just trying to survive the HOA. They were enjoying their lives again. The board meetings became shorter, not because people weren't interested but because there were fewer problems. Fewer complaints. Fewer reasons to argue. And the best part? People finally knew their rights. We handed out little booklets, not thick, confusing legal pages, but simple guides that explained what the HOA could and couldn't do. What homeowners were responsible for. What fines had to follow a process. For the first time, people understood the rules because they helped write them. The fear that Karen had used to control everything was gone. But I never forgot how it started. One fine. One letter. One wrong assumption that no one would speak up. I still kept a copy of that original violation notice. Not because it mattered anymore, but because it reminded me how important it is to question authority when it doesn't feel right. Because standing up, even when you're alone, can be the first step in something bigger than you ever imagined. Looking back, I don't think Karen ever expected people to push back. She thought we'd roll over, pay the fines, stay quiet. Maybe that's how it had always worked before. But this time was different. People were tired. People were ready. And when one person stood up, others followed. That's how everything changed. Not overnight. Not without trouble. But through steady, honest resistance. Today, no one asks who's in charge of the HOA because they already know. It's the community. It's the families and retirees and new homeowners who show up, who speak up, and who make decisions with fairness and care. We never needed Karen to lead us. We just needed each other. Life after Karen wasn't just quieter. It felt lighter. Like the weight of suspicion had finally lifted from every porch, every driveway, every neighbor-to-neighbor glance. People stopped checking their mailboxes with dread. The air felt different. The sidewalks felt safer. You didn't have to second-guess putting up a holiday wreath or where your trash bin sat on collection day. But the strange thing was, even after everything, some part of me kept waiting for a knock on the door. Maybe it was the habit of being cautious. Or maybe it was just a trace of fear, left over from all the months Karen ruled like a shadow over our homes. Then one morning I walked outside and saw something unexpected. A for sale sign. Not in front of my house. But in front of Karen's. She hadn't lived there for weeks. Her car was gone. Her lights never came on. But the sign made it official. She was leaving. Or maybe being forced to. No one knew for sure. People didn't celebrate. There were no loud cheers or good riddance comments. Just silence. And a quiet sense of closure. Like an old scar that had finally stopped itching. But while Karen's chapter was closing, something else was just beginning. That week, the new board held a neighborhood event. Not a meeting. Not a rule discussion. Just a simple afternoon gathering with lemonade, lawn chairs, and cookies. No agenda. Just people getting to know each other again. And that was the point, really. The HOA was never meant to control people. It was meant to connect them. Somewhere along the way, Karen had twisted that purpose into something ugly. But the truth is, an HOA is just a tool. It only works if the people behind it care more about community than control. As neighbors chatted and kids ran through sprinklers, I realized something that stayed with me. The most powerful thing we did wasn't pushing back against Karen. It was deciding we wouldn't be quiet anymore. That we'd talk to each other. Share stories. Stand up when things didn't feel right. Even the smallest voices had made a difference. I remember one neighbor, quiet, older man, barely said a word during meetings, who stood up one day and calmly read a paragraph from our state's homeowner laws. That one moment shut down Karen's attempt to charge us for using the community center. Just like that. Knowledge had power. And when shared, it multiplied. That's what changed everything. Now there are welcome packets for new residents. Not just documents and rules, but notes from neighbors. Contact lists. A shared garden schedule. We even started a community group chat, not for complaints but for recommendations, events, and sometimes just jokes. All of it came from the simple idea that no one should feel afraid in their own home. Karen's story became a reminder. A cautionary tale, sure, but also a turning point. She tried to take something that wasn't hers. She tried to turn neighbors into enemies. But in the end, she only made us stronger. Sometimes I still get asked what I'd say if I saw her again. What I'd do if she walked down our street. And honestly, I don't think I'd say anything at all. Because she already knows. She knows we saw through the lies. She knows the power she built was fake. And she knows the people she tried to silence were louder now than ever. And maybe that's the best ending to a story like this. Not revenge. Not shouting. Just peace. Because we earned it. And we're not giving it up again.